At my mom's retirement party, my uncle laughed. "We used your bonus to cover the catering. Hope you don't mind." Then my sister said, "Think of it as paying us back for existing." I just smiled, quietly transferred every shared account to zero, and advanced out. 15 minutes later, their phones lit up, followed by a knock at the door. I, 29M, thought I was being generous. Turns out, I was being played. The retirement party was in full swing when my uncle dropped the bomb. Mom had been working at the school district for 37 years, and the whole family had gathered at my sister's house to celebrate. I'd been looking forward to this day for months, mainly because I'd finally managed to surprise Mom with something special. 3 weeks earlier, I'd received my annual performance bonus, a hefty sum that represented months of overtime and weekend work at the consulting firm. Instead of putting it toward my own apartment fund like I'd planned, I decided to contribute toward Mom's retirement gift. The family had been discussing getting her a cruise to Alaska, something she'd mentioned wanting to do for years. I'd quietly transferred $5,000 into the shared family account we'd set up specifically for group gifts and expenses. I hadn't told anyone about the amount, just mentioned I'd contributed my part. The cruise was supposed to cost around $8,000 total, split between my uncle, my sister, my 2 cousins, and me. But standing there with a plate of catered food in my hands, listening to my uncle's booming laughter as he explained how they'd rated my contribution to pay for tonight's party, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. My uncle continued his explanation with the casual air of someone discussing the weather. He told me they'd decided the cruise was too expensive and impractical. Mom was getting older, and what if she got seasick? Instead, they'd thrown this party and used my bonus money to cover the catering, decorations, and venue rental for my sister's backyard. The caterers had indeed done a nice job. There were elegant table settings, a professional DJ, and enough food to feed twice the number of people present. But the whole thing couldn't have cost more than $2,000, tops. I asked what happened to the rest of the money. My sister appeared beside my uncle then, holding a glass of wine and wearing a new dress I didn't recognize. She explained, with the kind of matter-of-fact tone she'd used since we were kids when she wanted something I had, that they'd split the remainder among themselves. After all, they'd done all the planning and organizing. I should think of it as paying them back for existing, she said, laughing at her own joke. The words hit me like a physical blow. Paying them back for existing. As if my presence in the family was some kind of burden they'd graciously tolerated all these years. I stood there for a moment, processing what I'd just heard. Around us, the party continued. Mom was talking animatedly with her former colleagues. My cousins were taking selfies by the dessert table. The DJ was playing classic rock from the 70s. I asked my sister where exactly the money had gone. She gestured vaguely and explained that my uncle had used his share to make a payment on his new truck. She'd put her portion toward her credit card debt. My cousins had split their parts between a weekend trip to Vegas and some home improvements. My uncle patted my shoulder and told me not to look so serious. It was a party, after all. Besides, he added, I made good money at my job. I could afford it. That's when something shifted inside me. The cold feeling in my stomach spread outward, and suddenly I felt very calm and very clear about what needed to happen next. I smiled and told them it was fine. These things happen. Family first, right? They both relaxed visibly, probably relieved I wasn't going to cause a scene at Mom's party. My sister even gave me a quick hug and told me I was being very mature about it. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but instead went out to my car. The party was loud enough that no one noticed me slip away. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled out my phone. The shared family account wasn't the only financial connection I had with these people. Over the years, I'd been added to several accounts as a co-signer or joint holder. My sister had needed help qualifying for her mortgage 3 years ago, so I'd been added to her checking account to boost her credit profile. My uncle had asked me to be a co-signer on his business account when he started his handyman service. There were utilities in my name at my cousin's apartment because his credit was shot. I'd been the family's financial safety net for years, and I'd never really thought about it. When people needed help, I helped. When they needed someone with good credit to co-sign, I co-signed. When they needed emergency funds, I transferred money. But sitting in my car, listening to the distant sound of my mom's retirement party, I realized something. I was done being their ATM. I opened my banking app and started making transfers. Every shared account, every joint account, every account where I had access. I transferred my portions to my personal account. The amounts were larger than I'd expected. My sister's checking account had over $3,000. My uncle's business account had nearly $2,000. Various utility and credit accounts had smaller amounts, but it all added up. By the time I was finished, I'd reclaimed almost $12,000 of my own money that had been sitting in accounts with people who apparently saw my contributions as payment for the privilege of being related to them. The transfers would take a few minutes to process, but most would go through immediately since they were between accounts at the same bank. I sat in my car and waited. Then I started the engine and drove home. Update 1. I got home around 9:30 and made myself a sandwich. My apartment was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could actually relax. I'd been carrying the stress of trying to make everyone happy for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just exist without worrying about who needed what from me. Around 10:15, my phone started buzzing. The first call was from my sister. I let it go to voicemail. Then my uncle called. Voicemail. Then my sister again, followed immediately by a text asking where I was and why I'd left the party early. I was reading her message when someone started pounding on my apartment door. Through the peephole, I could see my sister and my uncle standing in the hallway. My sister was holding her phone, and my uncle had his arms crossed. They both looked angry. My sister called out to me, demanding I open the door. She knew I was home because my car was in the parking lot. We needed to talk about the money situation. I called back through the door that we could talk tomorrow. It was late, and I was tired. My uncle's voice came next, louder and more aggressive. He told me to stop being childish and open the door. What I'd done was theft, and if I didn't fix it immediately, he was calling the police. That actually made me laugh. I asked him if he wanted to explain to the police how it was theft for me to move my own money out of accounts I was legally entitled to access. The pounding stopped for a moment. I heard them talking to each other in hushed voices. Then my sister tried a different approach. She explained that there had been a misunderstanding at the party. They hadn't meant to hurt my feelings. But what I'd done was extreme, and it was going to cause serious problems. I asked what kind of problems. My uncle took over then, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. He explained that his business account was now overdrawn because he'd written checks assuming the money I'd transferred out would still be there. My sister was facing overdraft fees because she'd set up automatic payments based on her account balance, including my contribution. I told them that wasn't my problem. The hallway went quiet for a long moment. Then my sister's voice, smaller now, almost pleading. She asked if I realized what this would do to the family. Mom didn't know anything about what had happened at the party or about the money situation. Did I really want to ruin her retirement celebration over this? I walked closer to the door and spoke clearly so they could both hear me. I told them that I'd contributed $5,000 for Mom's cruise. They'd spent $2,000 on a party and pocketed the rest. If anyone had ruined Mom's retirement celebration, it wasn't me. More silence. Then footsteps. They were leaving. I looked through the peephole and watched them walk down the hallway toward the elevator. My sister was crying, and my uncle was gesturing angrily as he spoke to her. Update 2. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Most were from my sister and uncle, but there were also messages from my cousins and even a few from extended family members I rarely talked to. Apparently, word had spread quickly about what happened. The messages ranged from angry to pleading to manipulative. My uncle had sent several texts calling me selfish and ungrateful. My sister had written long paragraphs about family loyalty and how I was destroying relationships over money. One of my cousins had sent a message saying I was being petty and should consider how my actions affected everyone else. But the message that really got to me was from my mom. She'd texted me around midnight, asking if I was okay and saying she'd heard there was some kind of disagreement at the party. She hoped we could all work it out because family was the most important thing. I stared at that message for a long time. Mom had no idea what her celebration had cost me, both financially and emotionally. She didn't know that her brother and daughter had stolen from me and then laughed about it. She just knew that something had gone wrong, and she was trying to keep the peace like she always did. I made coffee and sat down to think about what I wanted to do next. Around 10 in the morning, my doorbell rang. This time it was just my sister, and she looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red, and she was wearing the same clothes from the party. I opened the door, but didn't invite her in. She started talking immediately, the words tumbling out in a rush. She apologized for what she'd said at the party. She'd been drinking, and she hadn't meant it the way it sounded. The comment about paying them back for existing was supposed to be a joke, but she realized now how hurtful it was. I listened without interrupting. She continued, explaining that they really had planned to use the money for Mom's cruise initially. But when they started looking into the details, they realized Mom might not be physically up for it. She'd been having some balance issues lately, and the family was worried about her traveling alone on a ship. I pointed out that Mom wouldn't have been traveling alone. The whole point was for it to be a family trip. My sister looked uncomfortable and admitted that not everyone could have afforded to go. The cruise itself was expensive, but there were also flights to consider and time off work and other expenses. It would have ended up being just me and Mom, which seemed unfair to everyone else. I asked why they hadn't discussed this with me before deciding to spend my money on something else. She didn't have a good answer for that. I asked about the $3,000 that had disappeared from the shared account beyond what the party cost. She fidgeted with her purse strap and explained that they'd seen it as compensation for all the work they'd put into planning the party. Organizing events was stressful, and they'd spent weeks coordinating everything. I asked if she thought planning a party was worth $1,500 of my money. She got defensive then, saying I was making it sound worse than it was. Families help each other out. I'd been fortunate with my career and my bonuses, and it was natural for me to contribute more than others who weren't as financially stable. That's when I realized we were having two completely different conversations. She was talking about family obligations and shared responsibilities. I was talking about being robbed by people I trusted. I told her I wanted my $5,000 back, minus the actual cost of the party. She said that wasn't possible. The money was already spent, and asking my uncle and cousins to pay it back would create even more family drama. I asked if she cared more about avoiding drama than about making things right with me. She was quiet for a moment, then asked what it would take to fix this. She suggested we could set up a payment plan where they gradually paid me back over time. I told her I'd think about it and asked her to leave. Update 3. That afternoon, I drove over to Mom's house. She was in her garden, transplanting some flowers she'd received as retirement gifts. She looked happy and relaxed, wearing old jeans and a sun hat, dirt under her fingernails. She saw me coming and waved, asking if I wanted some iced tea. We sat on her back porch, and she talked about how wonderful the party had been. She was still glowing from all the attention and kind words from her colleagues. She mentioned how proud she was of her family for putting together such a nice celebration. I listened and tried to figure out how to tell her what had really happened. Finally, I asked if she was disappointed about not getting the cruise. She looked surprised and said she didn't know what I meant. Nobody had mentioned a cruise to her. That hit me harder than I'd expected. They'd never even told her about the original plan. She had no idea that there had been $5,000 set aside for a trip she'd always wanted to take. I explained the whole situation, starting with my bonus and ending with the confrontation at my apartment. I tried to keep my voice level and just stick to the facts, but I could see her face changing as she understood what had happened. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, just staring at her hands. Finally, she asked if I was sure about the amounts and the timeline. I showed her the bank records on my phone. The initial transfer to the shared account, the party expenses, and the remaining balance that had been distributed among my uncle, sister, and cousins. She looked at the numbers for a while, then asked what I wanted to do about it. I told her I'd already taken back the money from the accounts I had access to, but that still left me short about $3,000. She nodded and asked if I thought there was a way to resolve this without tearing the family apart. I said I didn't know. Part of me wanted to let it go and just accept that I'd learned an expensive lesson about trusting the wrong people. But another part of me was angry about being taken advantage of and then made to feel guilty about standing up for myself. Mom was quiet again, then told me she'd talked to my uncle and sister. I asked her not to. This was between them and me, and I didn't want her getting pulled into the middle of it. She smiled sadly and said she was already in the middle of it. These were her children and her brother, and what they'd done reflected on how she'd raised them and the values she'd tried to instill in the family. Final update. 3 days later, I got a call from Mom asking me to come over for dinner. When I arrived, my sister and uncle were already there, sitting at the kitchen table looking uncomfortable. Mom had made her famous pot roast, and we ate mostly in silence. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. After dinner, Mom cleared her throat and said we needed to have a family meeting. She looked at my uncle and sister and told them she was ashamed of what they'd done. Taking my money without permission was bad enough, but lying about it and then trying to make me feel guilty for wanting it back was unacceptable. My uncle started to defend himself, but Mom held up her hand to stop him. She continued, saying that she'd spoken to each of them individually over the past few days, and she'd heard all their excuses and justifications. But at the end of the day, they'd stolen from me, and that was going to be made right. She pulled out an envelope and handed it to me. Inside was a check for $3,000. I asked where the money had come from. Mom explained that she'd taken it from her retirement account. She'd been planning to use some of her savings for home improvements. But this was more important. I tried to give the check back, saying I couldn't let her pay for their mistakes. She refused to take it and said it was already done. She'd rather lose some of her retirement money than lose her son over this situation. Then she turned to my uncle and sister and told them they now owed her the $3,000, not me. She expected to be paid back in full within 6 months, and if they couldn't manage that, they could work out payment plans with her directly. The room was dead silent. My uncle finally spoke up, asking if this meant I was going to put the money back in the shared accounts I'd emptied. I told him no. Those days were over. If they needed financial help in the future, they could ask like adults instead of just taking what they wanted and hoping I wouldn't notice. My sister started crying then, saying she was sorry and that she'd never meant for things to go this far. I looked at her and said I believed she was sorry she got caught. I wasn't sure she was sorry about what she'd done. Mom suggested we all take some time to cool off and think about how to move forward as a family. Over the next few weeks, my relationship with my uncle and sister remained strained. My uncle made a few attempts to act like nothing had happened, but I kept my distance. My sister sent me several long text messages apologizing and asking if we could start over, but I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. The $3,000 from Mom was eventually paid back. My uncle contributed $2,000, and my sister managed to scrape together the remaining $1,000. But the trust that had been broken couldn't be repaired with money. I learned something important from the whole experience. Being family doesn't give people the right to take advantage of you, and being generous doesn't mean being a pushover. I still help my mom when she needs it, and I've maintained relationships with the family members who weren't involved in the situation. But I'm much more careful about financial boundaries now. Sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones that teach us our own worth. The shared accounts stayed empty, and they stayed that way.